good afternoon, everyone, members and friends and visitors of St. Martin Lutheran Church. This is in Birch Run, Michigan. This is Pastor Jim Chinnery. Good to see you all again after a week of vacation. It was a great week of sun and fishing and relaxing, and but very glad to be back. As you all know, sometimes vacations can be exhausting. You need to get back to your regular schedule. So glad to be able to see you again. Just a couple thoughts before we begin reading for today, which is Psalm 125. And that is, the last few days at St. Martin, we've dealt with two funerals. We had the funeral for Jane Shem on Saturday, and those of you who knew Jane or had heard, Jane passed away quite suddenly last week. And special thanks to Reverend Kaiser, who, as I was on vacation, really stepped in, and thankfully he had known. Hi, Janet. He had known Jane personally, and was able to give spiritual care to the family in my absence, and during her service as well. For those of you, for some of the almost 1,700 people who watched her service on the live stream, was able to preach just a wonderful sermon, and to hear the wonderful blessed words of Stephanie and of Doob during the service itself. Just a great celebration of Jane's life and a celebration of her death as well. And as well as yesterday, we had our funeral service for Mr. Jim Hartley, a longtime member of St. Martin Lutheran Church, a beloved friend of me, and if you knew Jim, he was a great guy, and is going to be missed. And Jim passed away 3 months ago, but yet due to the COVID restrictions, we had to postpone his memorial service for some time, and finally 3 months later we were able to gather and to commend him to the care of the Lord, and to gather as the people of Christ. Hi, Sally. And so that was hi, Arlene. Thank you for welcoming me back. And so and those are kind of my daily thoughts. And so let's get to our reading for today. Psalm 125, a short psalm. The psalm is titled A Song of Ascents, A-S-C-E-N-T-S, as of ascending. And like the other in the series, there's 15 psalms. Psalms 120 to 134 are the 15 songs of ascents in the book of Psalms. And it was especially appropriate that pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem during one of the three major feasts, pilgrimage feasts, where people would go to Jerusalem, would be chanting and singing these songs on their way as they ascended to the Mount Zion, or ascended to Jerusalem. And these 15 psalms, these songs of ascents, they have a number of things in common. Each has the heading Song of Ascents. So if you're reading them in the book of Psalms, the heading is a song of ascent. And with the exception of Psalm 132, they're quite short, as 125 is today. And their concerns are often about familiar and family matters. They often deal with rural issues, the life of the farmer. In a series of lectures Luther did in the mid-1500s, he said this, that these psalms, these 15 psalms, deal with important teachings and almost all of the articles of our Christian faith, of preaching, of the forgiveness of sins, the cross, love, marriage, authorities, so that they set forth, as it were, a summary of all essential teachings. That he believed that within these 15 psalms are all the essential teachings of Christianity itself. And from another German theologian who wrote much later in the 1800s, he wrote this, that the world of these psalms is the world of the simple person and the little people, of the farmer, the hand worker, the mother with small children, the father of the family who works from early until late, who experiences both tears and jubilation, who rejoices at the festivals and thinks about religious matters. These psalms are witnesses from everyday life, witnesses of folk poetry and folk piety. So that these psalms, in a sense, are for people like you and I, normal, ordinary people. We're not particularly wealthy, at least as how our country determines wealth, as as you know, just the very fact that we live in this country, we're amongst the most wealthy in the world. But normal, not people, not famous, people like you and I who deal with everyday things. We are who these Psalms are written for. And the Psalm 125, it can be summarized as a psalm of trust, and it begins with a pair of comparisons in the first couple verses, illustrating the protection given those who trust in the Lord. That's the Psalm's definition for people who walk with God, those who trust in the Lord. And then it continues with a promise of the Lord's protection and concludes with a prayer for the people and an announcement about the fate of evildoers. And then the psalm ends with a simple blessing for Israel. And especially dominant in this psalm is the idea of trust. So let us read together Psalm 125. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved but abides forever. And the mountains surround Jerusalem. So the Lord surrounds his people from this time forth and forevermore. For the scepter of wickedness shall not rest on the land allotted to the righteous, lest the righteous stretch out their hands to do wrong. Do good, O Lord, to those who are good, and to those who are upright in their hearts. But those who turn aside to their crooked ways, the Lord will lead away with evildoers. Peace be upon Israel. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. Well, the psalm begins with this making a comparison of Jerusalem and the mountains surrounding Jerusalem. And these first two statements offer comparisons with the mountains of Jerusalem. In verse 1, believers are defined as those who trust in the Lord are compared to Mount Zion, the major mountain in the area of the city. And you know, a number of psalms celebrate Jerusalem and Mount Zion and the joys of living there. And the point of this comparison in verse 1 is that those who trust in the Lord will enjoy his security. And then the imagery shifts. So in verse 1, if the comparison is with the believer in Mount Zion, it shifts in verse 2, and now it's not believers but God who is compared to the mountains. And the psalm writer, you can imagine, has been traveling for days and has seen Jerusalem from afar. The sight of the city of God nestled in the middle of protecting mountains strikes the psalmist here as a good illustration of God's relationship to his people. That God surrounds them, that God protects us, that God cares for us. And once again, the duration of this relationship, forevermore. Forevermore. Another reminder that all human beings were created to live eternally. Eternally. And in Christ our hope and our trust and our faith are built upon the promise that we will live with God eternally on that day when he calls us home. Now, Jerusalem is not set upon one hill, but established amongst a series of many different hills. And God's people, the psalmist reminds us, can trust that Yahweh, that God, will surround and protect them as the mountains surround Jerusalem. So as Mount Zion is pictured, compared not only to the believer surrounded by the mountains of God, that God himself is the mountains that surround us. And the pilgrim, coming to Jerusalem on one of those festival days, saw these mountains, and with this song made a spiritual appreciation for the geography and comparing it to God. And this phrase that we see in verse 1, those who trust in the Lord, you know, this shows one of several facets of our relationship as named in the Old Testament, is our relationship with God. And along with trust, there's frequent mention of those who fear, those who love, and those who know God. And, you know, and this all speaks to a personal, intimate bond with God, not keeping him at a distance, but an intimate, close relationship. And, you know, throughout the New Testament as well, people are described in comparison to nature and the relationship to God. For example, in Matthew 7, some people are like sand, ever shifting and unstable. In James chapter 1, some people are like the sea, restless and unsettled. In Ephesians 4, some people are described like the wind, uncertain and inconsistent. And yet believers, Charles Spurgeon wrote, are like a mountain, strong and stable and secure, no matter what is going on around us. That God's surrounding protection will be with believers forever, as Jesus promised in Matthew 28, that I am with you always, even till the end of the age. And then in verse 3, there's a promise and a prayer. Verse 3 promises that foreign powers will never forever rule in Jerusalem, or for the land allotted to the righteous. And what's interesting is Luther and other theologians believe that this psalm was written during a time of oppression, so that even under oppression, the promise was there that the evil will not rule over the land of the righteous forever. Why? Because the righteous could be drawn to crooked ways, to transgress, to evil ways. John Chrysostom, who was an early church father, wrote this about this verse, that God does like a lute player, the lute being a small stringed instrument, who will not let the strings of his lute be too slack, lest it mar the music, nor suffer them to be too hard stretched or screwed up, lest they break. Very interesting. And then we go on to read, do good, O Lord, to those who are good. It's a prayer for the righteous. And it's one of the primary features of the old covenant that God made with the Israelites at Mount Sinai, was this simple principle of blessing their obedience and cursing their disobedience. A very clear stipulation of the old covenant God made with the children of Israel. And here the singer or the psalmist simply prayed that God would fulfill that aspect of the covenant and do good for those who are good, which really highlights the amazing revelation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, is that God did good for those who are not good. That God didn't wait for the unrighteous to become righteous to do good. That we remember in due time that God died for the ungodly. Romans 5. And that God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And the psalm begins with a pair of pictures of the lives of those who trust in the Lord. They're described as sturdy as a mountain, surrounded by the Lord, represented again by sturdy mountains, just as Jerusalem is surrounded by mountains on the Judean countryside. And it concludes with a wish for those who place their trust in the Lord. And then it ends with these simple words, and peace be upon Israel. Shalom. Peace. And these last and final words that sort of tie this psalm together, that Israel, the people of God, will find peace when they let the weight of their cares rest on the sturdy support of the Lord. That they will discover that shalom, peace, that, of course, as Christians, we would describe as the peace that passes all understanding. The peace that even in the midst of death can be at peace, even through tears, even in uncertain times as we are in now, we can be at peace because we know our trust is in the sturdy mountains of the Lord. Amen. Well, the song that I chose for this morning is Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. And then this is an interesting psalm. It was written by a guy named Robert Robinson in 1758. And he had an interesting life. It's always interesting to summarize someone's life in a couple minutes, but his father died when he was very young. He lived in London, just outside the city. His father died when he was very young, and his mother, of course, being sick, being a widow, and them being very poor, he was indentured. Now, in England, and this actually picked over to the American colonies in the 17 and 1800s. It kind of phased out, as I understand it, in the later part of the 1800s. But indentured servitude, some would call slavery, but indentured servitude, oftentimes people would voluntarily sort of give themselves over from anywhere from 4 to 7 years as a servant. And this could be in any realm. Sometimes it would be serving perhaps a rich person in their house, or in Robert Robinson's case, he was indentured to a hairdresser, right? Indentured to a hairdresser. and that didn't really sit well with him. He finished his duties, but he was known as this sort of smart, intelligent guy. His mother had always wished that he would go on to be a clergyman, but as it is today, even in the 1700s, it took a lot of resources, money, and time to be. And yet Robert Robinson, after his indenturement, he did go on to become a clergyman, and first serving in the Free Methodist Church and then the Independent Methodist Church, and then later moving over to the Baptist Church. But he was a prolific songwriter, and his songs are described, songs it's reminiscent of someone who has struggled and yet has learned to put their trust in the Lord. And this song, if you know it, verse 2 has this interesting phrase about, here I raise my Ebenezer. Here I raise my Ebenezer. And unless you're quite familiar with the Old Testament, that's going to seem an odd phrase. But that comes from 1 Samuel. And where we read that, then Samuel, and this is from 1 Samuel 7, and Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen, and called its name Ebenezer, for he said, till now the Lord has helped us. So the Philistines were subdued and did not again enter the territory of Israel. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. That as a reminder of this great victory, Samuel took a great stone and raised it as a memorial. And as he raised it, he called the name of the stone Ebenezer, or stone of help, or a stone of God's presence. And that the people of the Lord, if they needed reminders of God's goodness, they could look upon this stone called Ebenezer and be reminded of God's help. So, come thou fount of every blessing. Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise, while the hope of endless glory fills my heart with joy and love. Teach me ever to adore thee, may I still thy goodness prove. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let that grace now like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above. Oh, that day when, free from sinning, I shall see thy lovely face, clothed and in the blood-washed linen, how I'll sing thy wondrous grace. Come, my Lord, no longer tarry, take my ransom soul away. Send thine angels soon to carry me to realms of endless day. Are we not prone to wander? Wow, I really, that hymn really hits upon it. It has everything a hymn should have. It has a nice tune, and it's theologically sound, and it makes us think, and yet we're praising the Lord. So before I do my benediction, I just want to close. It's sort of an apology. I guess it's a half apology, and I'm always careful. I think if we apologize too often, we diminish what apologies are for. But I am. On my last stream, just let me say this. I closed my last stream. I had no intention that people would take from that I was leaving St. Martin. As you can probably tell, a lot of my live streams are unscripted. I do preparation, especially in God's Word and a little bit of hymn history. But much of else what I say just kind of comes from the heart or off the cuff. So it was not my intention that people would take from that I was leaving St. Martin. And I can promise you that if that day comes where you will know well ahead of time. You will know well ahead of time. I will not go on a live stream and complain about how hard I've worked, and then later you're going to find I'm gone. I promise you, you will know well ahead of time. So with that, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. Receive the Lord's blessing and be a blessing to others. Thank you so much for your time. I love you all, and I will see you soon. God bless.